Hi everyone. So this is Genesis, and today I will be presenting my um, We Develop assessment that is for third grade personal narrative assessment. So before I get started, I wanted to give you guys a little quick background of uh, the students. So the assessment was assigned to third graders. And the number of students in the classroom are 25. 15 are girls and 10 are boys. The majority of the students are from Latino descent, except for the for two students, one who's Asian and the other one who is from Egypt. So many of these students come from middle to low socioeconomic backgrounds, which and they live through the boroughs of Queens, New York. Um, 10 out of the 25 students are multilingual learners, and they're all from the different proficiency levels. So one student is from the entering level, another student for the emerging level, and 8 students are from the expanding proficiency level. And their home language um, for the students are Spanish. The home language is Spanish, Cantonese, and Arabic, and as well as English. Um, and some of the students' parents, they speak to them in Spanish, um, one in Cantonese, and the rest of them communicate in either English or Spanish with their parents and other family members. Um, 8 out of the 10 students have lived in the United States for the majority of their life, with the exception of 2 of them. So one of them recently arrived from Ecuador, and that's the entering student, and the emerging student arrived from Guatemala about 2 years ago. And although some of these students often recognize the dominant language of English in their school, for many of them, their home language is Spanish, Cantonese, and Arabic. Here. So I'm gonna give you guys a background on the original assessment using the PUMI. And so the purpose for this assessment is for the students to write a narrative relating to a personal experience. So students have to describe a story in their life with the following components, which is a description of the main event, description of the people and their stories, um, detailing their stories with dialogue, and other personal observations. And so through this assessment, students are basically to entertain the reader and get them engaged by simply just relying the personal story on an emotional engagement in an emotional engagement way. And the results for this assessment will be used to determine if the students can write a personal story that focuses on a small moment, uh, which consists of the title, an overarching introduction of the event, uh, providing details related to the experience or the event, detailed image, dialogue related to the story, what the story is about, and a conclusion. And all while effectively relying on the writer's voice, the audience awareness throughout the story. Um, and the method that is most appropriate to this assessment is the writing response, in which the students will have to produce a clear and detailed writing piece along with the rubric. And in the writing response, students need to basically uh, structure their narrative stories in order to produce a clear and cohesive writing piece. And the instruments that's needed to carry this assessment is a rubric as well as a tablet or computer with Google's Translator. And here are some of the uh, like lead promises and the deficiencies from the original assessment. So some of the promises is that the student is able to retell a small moment in their life, so a personal experience. Students have the opportunity to receive uh, peer assessment. So this is done after, I'm sorry, it's done like in between the revision part. And students have background knowledge of their personal story, and it's meaningful and culturally relevant. Now, some of the deficits of the assessment is that the rubric is not accessible before the assessment. Also, the assessment is not aligned to the students' ELP levels. And students are also required to use quote unquote interesting words and sound words. And students are scored on a scale of 1 to 10. Once again, not tied to their ELP levels. And translanguaging is not allowed in the assessment. Um, so here is the original rubric. I'm not sure why my letterings are a little messed up here. Um, so as you can see here, it's a pretty long rubric. So the rubric is broken down into three components. So the three components are here, which is structure, development, and the language convention. So the performance indicators of the structure here is overall, leading, uh, trans, transitioning, organization, and ending. So first, the overall component describes if the writer tells the story bit by bit with a clear and detail with clear details. Secondly, the leading component describes if the writer has a beginning in which they help the reader know who the characters are and what the setting is. The third, which is transitioning component, describes if the writer uses a paragraph, skip lines, it separates what happens first from last, and in their story. And the story was thought out and it included a lot of details. And lastly, the ending component describes if the writer has a clear ending that shows the writer chosen actions, talk, and feelings. And these performance indicators are supported by the Common Core uh, standards, which are listed right here. And for the performance indicators for development, we have indicator and craft. So for indicator, it basically, I'm sorry, for the indicator component, it describes if the writer uses dialogue and descriptions of action, thoughts, and feelings to develop experiences and event or shows response to the characteristics of the situation. And the craft component, which is on here, is supported, which is supported by these standards right here, and which establishes the situation and introduces the narrator, the character, and organizes an event sequence that unfolds naturally, as well as the use of exciting words to grab the reader's attention throughout their writing. And lastly, the performance indicator of language convention, which are spelling and punctuation. And then for spelling, the writer has to demonstrate command uh, of the convention of the standard English grammar and use it when writing. And for punctuation, uh, the writer has to demonstrate command of the Convention of Standard English, capitalization, punctuation, and spelling when writing. And all these are, of course, supported by the Common Core standards. And here I have my redeveloped assessment, um, supported by, so each one is supported by the Common Core standards, similar to the original assessment. And so this assessment, the modified assessments, is divided into two components, which is the language and content. And the language is broken down into the students, basically the students' linguistic demands, and the content demand, which I will explain more later. So the linguistic demands, based on the language instructions of the three students that I have, which is entering, emerging, and expanding. So the language demand for the students will be approached in the assessments are identifying events and dialogue. And here, the first one, and feelings, in which requires verbs and adjectives. The other component that's describing the characters in details by focusing on what the character says, does, and likes and thinks. And lastly, it identifies the sequence of the event by using temporal words and phrases to describe the signal event order. And as you can see here, for the entering student, uh, the student has to use like simple subject verbs agreements and short model sentence. So this is what it will look like. I played, I felt sad, happy, nervous. And of course, students will have room to either use um, their home language or use the new language. And here, this for the emerging level, students will have to use simple and or complex subjects, verbs, agreement with support. And once again, they have the option to use the, oops, sorry, use the, oops, use their home language or the new language. And then over here we have the second part, the redevelopment assessment, in which is broken down to three-part components, which is more specific to the assessment. So they have the introduction of the narrator, character, organization, and the event sequence that unfolds naturally, creating a clear, coherent writing piece, and students identifying the elements of their personal narrative. So, for example, here, an entry students will have to identify two elements of the personal narrative, which it can be a character and setting. Compared to an emerging student, the students can identify at least three elements, which can be character, setting, or conflict. And the expanding students can identify five elements of their personal narrative, which is all five elements: character, setting, plot, conflict, and solution. And so here is the lead promises, how the redeveloped assessment improves facility and compared to the original assessment. So, um, it, so we have here it's modify the assessment, which leads to promises for multilingual learning by providing the rubric before the assessment, contact and visual aid, as well as the use of nonverbal communication, model sentence or sentence frame, the opportunity to use translanguaging students, translanguaging, and students are not scored on a scale of 1 to 4, and the assessment is differentiated to the students' ELP levels. So this is improving the deficit um,